She was sold for $50 in a lame buckskin horse. No one asked if she wanted to go. They put her in a wagon with a wooden trunk and a cheap satin dress that scratched her neck. The preacher barely looked up when he signed the paper. The man who took her had tobacco-stained teeth and laughed loud when she didn't answer his first question. The road into the desert felt endless, the sun licking the wagon's canvas, the heat pressing down like punishment. She kept her eyes low, hands folded in her lap like they still had the power to shield her. She didn't cry anymore. Crying had dried up long before now. The little town where he left her looked carved from dust and wind. Two men stared like she was meat in a butcher's window. A woman whispered something and turned her face. The house she was meant to live in was a cracked wooden shell. No curtains, no scent of life. Inside, the new husband drank before dinner. When he spoke, his words cut like dull knives. When she stayed quiet, he spat on the floor. Cold as a mute snake, he said. By the third night, he didn't come back. Sent a note with a store boy. Don't want her, send her back. She sat on the porch step until the wind dusted her eyes. No one came. She walked to the station alone, dragging her trunk. Slept under a tree. The dress was already stained, her feet swollen. A man in a suit passed and didn't see her. A boy laughed. Another spit near her boot. Her silence unsettled. Folks like a prayer said in the wrong place. It was there, between dust and disdain, that he saw her. He sat atop a dark horse, hat tipped low, hands broad and steady on the reins like the whole world depended on that grip. He looked at her the way a man reads scripture in an unfamiliar tongue, slowly, carefully. She didn't speak. Not even when. He dismounted, tied his horse to a post, and walked over slow. He didn't ask what happened, didn't offer pity. He just looked at her for a while, like he was waiting for something quiet to rise from her stillness. He touched the brim of his hat and nodded once, then pointed to the saddle. She hesitated. Her fingers trembled around the handle of her trunk, but she didn't look away from his face. Something in the way he moved, measured and calm, told her. He wasn't a man who needed answers out loud. She climbed up behind him without a word. The ride was long and quiet. She held the back of the saddle, not him, and he never looked over his shoulder. But he didn't ride fast. He kept a pace that matched the rhythm of her breath, as if somehow he could hear it. The ranch sat at the edge of nowhere, tucked between dry hills and crooked cottonwoods. The house was plain but clean. Smoke rose from the chimney. Two dogs watched her from the porch but didn't bark. The air smelled of hay, leather, and earth after an old rain. Inside, he showed her a room with a cot, a wash basin, and a single window. He lit a lamp and left it on the table. No questions, no rules, just a soft nod, and then he walked away. She sat on the cot and stared at the wall. The next morning, there was bread on a plate and coffee in a tin cup. He had left early to mend a fence. She found a broom near the door and swept the porch. Without thinking, not out of duty, just because something in her needed the sound of bristles on wood. He returned at dusk, covered in dust. She placed a bowl of stew on the table and stepped back. He signed something with his hands. Slowly. She didn't understand, but he smiled gently and pointed to his ear, then to his mouth. He was deaf. Something inside her unclenched. She nodded just once. From then on, they spoke in silence. She watched his hands. He watched her eyes. There were no loud voices, no questions she couldn't answer. Only small gestures. A shared cup of coffee, a nod of thanks, the passing of tools. His world didn't ask for noise. She found herself breathing easier. At night, the house creaked in its own rhythm. He read by the lamp. She mended her dress by the fire. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was whole. Like snow before the storm, like a hymn before the first word. One morning, she woke to find a book left on the table. A children's book filled with drawings and simple signs. He had marked the pages with small pieces of cloth. She ran her fingers over the drawings. She traced the signs with her hands. He watched her from the doorway, arms crossed, waiting. She raised her hand slow and signed the word for thank you. It came out crooked, hesitant. But he smiled like she'd spoken gold. He never asked her name. Not because he didn't care, but because names were not how he understood people. He read them through their hands, their steps, the silence they carried. Still, she knew he wanted to know. She could feel it in the way his eyes lingered when she passed, in the way he paused. Before signing goodnight, she told him in the only way she knew how. One evening, as the sky bled orange over the hills, she took a stick and scratched her name into the dirt by the barn, Clara. He crouched beside it, ran his fingers over the letters. Then, in a slow, practiced motion, he signed her name back. To her. Once. Then again. Clara. She hadn't heard her name in weeks. Maybe longer. Seeing it move from his hands to her chest felt like a benediction. That night, she couldn't sleep. Not from fear, but from the strange warmth growing in her ribs. It was new, unfamiliar. Like the wind had shifted and brought something gentle with it. In the mornings, she fed the chickens and boiled water. He repaired the barn roof. Sometimes he left notes in pencil, simple sketches with small words under them. Bread, fence, rain. She traced each one before folding it carefully into a wooden box he gave her. They moved around each other like two old trees growing side by side. Quiet, patient, rooted in loss, but reaching for light. He had photographs in a small drawer by his bed, faded and curled. One of a woman with a long braid and soft eyes. Another of a small boy, maybe 4 years old, holding a stick like a sword. She found them once while cleaning, but didn't touch. Just looked, then closed the drawer. That night, she found a new paper on the table. It was a drawing of the same. Woman and boy, but this time, they were drawn as outlines only. Hollow, like shadows. Below it, he had drawn her, standing in front of the house, with a broom in hand and the wind lifting her hair. There was no word written this time, just a soft pencil line connecting the past to the present. She pressed the paper to her chest. He had carried grief like a stone in his gut. She could see it in the way he watched the horizon too long, in the way he never sat with his back to a door. Whatever had taken them, his wife, his boy, it had carved something deep in him. But he never brought it into the room, never let it turn to anger or bitterness. Clara, too, had her wounds. But in his silence, she found shelter. And perhaps in hers, he found peace. One afternoon, she followed him to the creek that wound behind the pasture. He knelt to mend a broken fence post. She stood nearby, watching the water crawl over the rocks. Suddenly, a low whistle cut through the air. She turned fast. A rider on the ridge. Tall, thin, eyes sharp like broken glass. He didn't wave, didn't speak, just stared. The rancher stood slowly, his back straightening as if from instinct. He signed something to her. Urgent. Stay back. Clara's stomach turned to stone. The man on the horse spit into the dirt, gave a half smile, then turned and rode off. No words were exchanged, but Clara understood. Not everyone left the past behind. Some came looking for what they thought still belonged to them. That night, the air around the ranch turned still. Even the dogs didn't bark. Clara watched him move through the house with quiet purpose. He locked the back door, checked the rifle, then sat at the table, turning the same empty cup in his hands. He didn't sign anything, didn't draw, just sat, eyes fixed on a memory only he could see. She made tea, though neither of them drank it. The steam rose between them, fading into the dim lamplight. Clara wanted to ask who the man was, but the weight in his shoulders told her he already knew. That Danger by name. She cleaned the cup, blew out the lamp, lay awake with her hands over her chest, counting his footsteps on the wooden floor as he walked the house into silence. In the days that followed, the ranch took on a different rhythm. He stayed closer to home, watched the ridge more than the sky, and when he looked at Clara, it was as if he was trying to remember every line of her face, in case something came to take her. Still, nothing happened. The man didn't return, but the threat lived in every shadow. And Clara, who had once been discarded like a broken trinket, began to understand something new. She was no longer invisible. She was being protected, not with words, but with presence, with steadiness, with the kind of love that didn't need to name itself to exist. Each evening, he showed her more signs, fingers moving slow and certain. She learned safe, trust, stay. He taught her home last. She signed it back with trembling hands. The pasture bloomed with tall grass and shy deer. Mornings brought mist that curled under the fence rails. Sometimes they sat on the porch without speaking for hours, watching the light move. It wasn't peace, not fully, but it was a beginning. One morning, she found a worn coat folded at the foot of her bed. It was his, too big for her shoulders, smelled of cedar and ash. Tucked in the pocket, a small knife and a note in his handwriting. If they come, don't run. Stand beside me. Her throat ached. She folded the note into her skirt pocket and wore the coat like armor. Later that week, she stood beside him while he repaired the well. Their hands moved together, passing tools without sound. When she looked up, he was watching her, not like someone afraid, but like someone who had made a decision. He signed something she didn't know, then slowly did it again. You belong here. She couldn't sign back. Not yet. But she placed her hand gently over his. And in that gesture, she said everything. He had never asked her what she had run from, and she had never spoken of it. But the silence between them had grown full, like a field before harvest, carrying things neither could name out loud. Until the man on the ridge returned. It was mid-morning. She was hanging linens when the dogs barked, low and wary. Dust curled up from the trail, and there he was again, mounted, still and sharp as a splinter. He didn't call out, just waited. The rancher came from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He saw the man and stopped, the calm draining from his face like color from cloth. He walked toward him, slow, deliberate. Clara moved to follow, but he lifted one hand without turning. Stay. She froze by the fence. The two men stood 10 feet apart. The stranger said something. The rancher didn't move, just stared. The man's tone rose. His hand went to the saddlebag. She didn't hear the word, but she saw his mouth shape it. Wife. Her body locked. He knew. Somehow, he knew where she had gone. Maybe he'd tracked the paper. Maybe someone in town had spoken. Maybe he'd come for money, or pride, or to drag her back like property reclaimed. She stepped forward. The rancher raised a hand again. Then he signed something, sharp and clean. She stays. The man sneered, said something else, too fast to catch. He pointed to Clara, then drew a slow finger across his throat. The rancher didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his hand resting at his side. The stranger shifted in his saddle, sensing the quiet storm beneath the surface. For a moment, it felt like the world held its breath. Then the stranger spat again, turned his horse, and rode out. The dust didn't settle for hours. That night, Clara couldn't eat. She sat by the fire with her hands in her lap, the knife from the coat heavy in her pocket. He sat across from her, eyes watching the door. When he finally looked at her, he signed one word: danger. Then another. Not over. She nodded. The next morning, they saddled both horses. She had never ridden alone. He led her through dry canyons and old trails, showing her where to go if she had to, where the creek bent into a thicket, where a cave sat hidden beneath. The bluffs. He gave her a pouch with matches, jerky, and bullets she didn't know how to use. When she looked up at him, unsure, he touched her hand. Signed, only if you must. They didn't speak the rest of the ride. That night, she lay awake listening to the wind scrape the eaves. Every sound stretched thin, every creak in the wood a warning. But he was there, just beyond the door, sitting in his chair, rifle across his knees. And for the first time in her life, Clara wasn't just afraid of being taken. She was afraid of losing something that finally felt like hers. 3 days passed. Nothing. No rider. No dust trail. No threat on the ridge. But peace didn't return either. It waited, holding its breath alongside them. She kept her boots by the door. The knife never left her pocket. He slept in the chair, one eye half open, his body too alert for rest. Even the dogs seemed to sense it, tails low, ears twitching. At shadows. Then, just after dusk on the 4th night, the chickens screamed. He was already on his feet before the last feather hit the ground. Clara grabbed the lamp. Heart pounding, legs cold as river stones, she moved toward the door, but he blocked her path, shook his head, signed quick, stay inside. She hesitated. He pointed once, firm, then turned and vanished into the dark. She stood at the window, the lamplight behind her making her reflection blur into the glass. For a moment, the yard looked empty. Then, movement near the barn. 2 figures. One, she knew instantly by the shape of his shoulders. The other, taller, thinner. Voices now. Faint. Distant. Then a shout. She ran. Out the back door, across the dirt. Barefoot, not thinking. By the time she reached the barn, the men were circling each other like wolves. The stranger had a pistol drawn. The rancher held nothing. But he didn't back down. You think silence makes you weak? The stranger barked. You think I won't? He didn't finish. Clara stepped into the light. The stranger turned, startled. His gun shifted toward her, and something broke inside the man she had come to love. He charged. The two men crashed to the ground. The gun skidded across the dirt. They rolled, fists dull against flesh, grunts lost in the dust. Clara reached for the gun, but her fingers fumbled. The rancher pinned the man down, but the stranger twisted, pulling a knife from his boot, raised it. Clara screamed his name, not signed, not whispered, spoken. The sound cracked the air like thunder. The rancher turned. The knife caught him in the shoulder, not deep, but enough. He slammed the man's wrist against the ground until the blade fell. Then he stood, bleeding, trembling, and alive. She ran to him, touched his arm, then his face. Her hands moved without thought. You, safe, home. He touched her lips, then signed back. You spoke. She hadn't realized it until then. Her voice, buried so long, had returned not in fear, but in defense of what mattered. The stranger lay groaning in the dirt. The dogs circled, teeth bared. The rancher tied his hands with a rope from the barn. No words exchanged, just a nod toward the edge of the property. Clara watched him disappear into the night, dragged like the weight he was. When they reached the porch, she touched his wound. He winced but didn't pull away. She brought water, thread, needle, and while she stitched, he watched her, not in pain, but with awe. Not because she had screamed, but because she had chosen to break silence for him. The house smelled of smoke and sage the next morning. Clara rose early, wrapped his shoulder with fresh cloth, then sat beside the stove without speaking. The teapot whistled, sharp and short, like a bird call, but neither of them moved. He signed slowly with his good hand. You saved me. She shook her head. Then, with trembling fingers, she responded. You saved me first. The words weren't perfect, the signs a little crooked, but he understood. He always had. They stayed close that day. The chores were left undone. The barn door swung on its hinge. A quiet stillness settled over the ranch. Not fear this time, but something softer. Reverence, maybe. The kind that follows storms. Late in the afternoon, she found him by the tree behind the corral, the one with the two horseshoes nailed into the trunk like crooked eyes. He was carving something into the bark with his knife. When she stepped closer, she saw it. Clara. Below it, her name in sign. And beneath that, his name. Elias. It was the first time she had seen it. She traced each letter with the tip of her finger, then looked up at him, the sun turning his gray hair to silver. She signed his name. He smiled. That night, they sat on the porch as the moon rose heavy and gold over the hills. One of the dogs lay with its head in her lap. The other rested by Elias's feet. A jar of fireflies flickered beside them on the railing, their light soft and stuttering. Tell me, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't falter. He turned toward her. About them. Your wife. Your boy. He didn't speak, but he reached into his pocket and handed her a folded page from his journal. Inside, a sketch, 3 hands in a circle. A small one, a slender one, and his. Beneath it, in uneven pencil, we spoke with our hands, but loved with our whole selves. She pressed the page to her chest. Did it take long to stop hurting? She asked. He looked away, then back. Signed, I never stopped. I just found room beside it. She nodded. Then slowly, she leaned her head on his shoulder. And he didn't move. They stayed like that until the moon dropped behind the hills. Two souls once discarded by the world, now stitched together in silence, in sorrow, and in something that tasted like healing. Not the kind that erases the past, the kind that makes peace with it. As they rose to go inside, he took her hand, pressed something into her palm, the silver ring from his drawer. It was bent slightly, worn thin with years. She looked at it, then at him. No words, just a single sign. If you choose to stay. She didn't answer right away. Clara held the ring in her hand like it was made of breath, something too light to hold, too precious to let fall. The metal carried warmth from his skin. A memory, maybe, or a promise waiting to be spoken. Elias didn't press her. He stepped back, hands still, eyes steady, letting silence have its say. She stared at the small curve of silver, thought of the way her life had once been decided without her voice. Bought, traded, passed over. The world had taught her that. Being quiet meant being forgotten. But here, on this ranch, in this silence, she had been heard without ever needing to raise her voice. She slipped the ring onto her finger, not to belong to a man, to belong to herself, and to the life they had built in soft, quiet pieces. The next morning, the light poured through the windows like something holy. Elias was already outside, feeding the horses with one arm, his movements a little slower, but no less steady. The dogs chased sparrows through the grass. The creek in the distance hummed low, like a lullaby that never ended. Clara stepped out, barefoot. She didn't speak, just walked to him, reached for the feed sack without waiting to be asked. He smiled. Together, they moved through the morning, measured, present, whole. At midday, the sheriff came by. The man who'd come for Clara had been found in the next county, arrested on another matter. Wouldn't be coming back, the sheriff said. Elias nodded once. Clara didn't flinch. After he left, they sat by the garden Elias had started months before. Beans curling up twine, tomatoes fat on the vine. It would be a good season. Clara placed her hand over the soil. Grow, she signed. Elias smiled, then repeated the sign. Grow. In the days that followed, they opened the house again, repaired the barn door, fixed the gate. Clara started leaving the window open at night, the air full of summer and bird song. She began teaching him how to read her lips, and in return, he taught her more signs, more words. Love, strong, begin. The past didn't vanish. It lived quietly between them, like a scar you stop covering up. But it no longer ruled the room. And one morning, as they sat on the porch, drinking coffee in worn tin cups, a boy rode up the trail, barefoot, thin, no more than 9. He held a torn hat in his hands, eyes wide with hunger and dust. He didn't say anything, just looked. Clara stood first, walked to him, knelt. What's your name? She asked. He whispered it. She took his hand and led him to the steps. Elias brought water, bread, a chair. They didn't need to ask where he came from. Some stories were the same shape, and some silences know how to welcome what the world has thrown away. Since that morning, the ranch never echoed with silence again.